Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail. Picture it. You're huddled on the damp heaving deck of a Viking longship. The air, sharp and cold, carries the sting of salt spray that kisses your face with an unwelcome intimacy. Waves, the color of hammered pewter under a bruised sky, rise and fall around your vessel, each one a liquid mountain you somehow miraculously surmount only to slide down its far side into another trough. The cries of gulls fade behind you as the familiar scent of wood smoke and land gives way to the clean, vast, and slightly terrifying aroma of the open ocean. This is the North Atlantic, and you're heading west into the shimmering unknown horizon where the sun bleeds into the sea each evening. It's not exactly a luxury cruise with a buffet and shuffleboard tournaments, is it? Your chances of actually making it back to tell the tale, if this were, say, the late 8th or early 9th century, well, let's just say your holiday insurance premiums would be astronomical. You'd probably complain more about the lack of a decent latte than the very real possibility of becoming fish food, if we're being brutally honest with ourselves about modern fortitude. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always love to see where everyone's tuning in from, so feel free to drop your current location and maybe the local time in the comments below. It's always a little bit magical to think of us all, scattered across the globe, drifting off together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The timbers of your longship, the Havganda, perhaps sea serpent, groan a rhythmic, almost living song around you. It's a sound that will become the soundtrack to your days and nights, a constant companion as you leave the rugged coastline of Norway, or perhaps Denmark, dwindling into a faint, jagged line astern. You're packed in, shoulder to shoulder, with a score or more of your shipmates. Personal space is a rather optimistic concept here. Imagine a particularly cramped camping trip, but your tent is perpetually damp, smells faintly of fish, old wool, and the vague, unsettling aroma of 30 unwashed Vikings who haven't seen a proper bath in weeks. And of course, this camping trip lasts for weeks, maybe months, with no friendly park ranger to call if you run out of fermented shark. The primary onboard entertainment you suspect might be competitive snoring or speculating on who will be the first to fall overboard during a particularly violent lurch. Your vessel, a marvel of its age, is clinker built. This means the hull planks overlap, like shingles on a roof, and are fastened together with iron rivets. This construction gives the ship remarkable flexibility, allowing it to ride the waves rather than fight them, twisting and yielding like a living creature. It's surprisingly shallow in its draft, meaning it doesn't need deep water to sail, which is brilliant for raiding up rivers or landing on unfamiliar beaches. Not so brilliant, perhaps, if you're aiming for maximum stability in a North Atlantic gale. Historians still argue about the precise blend of foolhardiness and genius that went into these early voyages into the truly open ocean, far from any comforting sight of land. Were they pushed by overpopulation, drawn by whispers of new territories, or simply possessed by an insatiable curiosity, coupled with a rather cavalier attitude towards, well, drowning? You run a hand along the wet gunwale, feeling the slickness of sea salt and the coarse grain of the oak. Overhead, a single large square sail, perhaps striped in bold red and white, or a deep resonant blue, bellies out in the steady wind. It's made of heavy wool, likely treated with animal fats to make it more water resistant. The thrum of the wind in the rigging, the slap of waves against the hull, the rhythmic creak of the mast in its step. These are the dominant sounds. Sometimes if the wind dies, the men will take to the oars, their grunts and the splash of the long ash oars adding a percussive beat to the ocean's sigh. There's a massive steering oar, a steerboard, from which we get our word starboard, on the right side of the stern, manned by a grim-faced fellow whose beard seems to stream sideways in the wind regardless of its actual direction. He looks like he was born with that oar in his hand, wrestling the sea for dominance. The journey westward is daunting. You're not just nipping over to Britain for a quick spot of enthusiastic redistribution of wealth, as it were. This is a far more ambitious undertaking. You might be aiming for the Faroe Islands, or Iceland, already known by this time but still sparsely settled. Or perhaps your captain, a man with eyes like chipped ice and a scar that tells its own silent saga, has heard whispers of lands further still, Greenland, or even beyond. The sagas, those grand sprawling narratives composed centuries later, speak of these voyages with a certain stoic heroism, but they often gloss over the sheer mind-numbing boredom, the chapped hands, the constant damp, and the ever-present gnawing uncertainty. It's easy to imagine a Viking a bit like a modern teenager on a long car journey. Are we there yet? Are those distant clouds land? Or just more clouds? Except the penalty for getting it wrong isn't missing the next service station. It's a rather more permanent disappearance into the cold gray void. For now, the coastline is still a comforting if fading presence. You can still smell the pine and the damp earth when the wind shifts just right. But soon, that too will be gone. Then it will just be you, your damp companions, your groaning ship, and the endless, indifferent ocean. And the big question will begin to loom, larger and larger with every passing league. How, in this vast, featureless expanse, do you actually know where you're going? When the sun plays hide and seek with the clouds, or fog rolls in thicker than your grandmother's prize-winning porridge, how do you keep the Havgander pointed towards that distant, hoped-for shore, and not just sailing in a very large, very wet circle? The answer, my friends, is what we're here to gently unravel. Now, the Vikings weren't fools. They wouldn't just point their dragon-proud ships vaguely west and hope for the best, chanting, "Odin, take the wheel." Though, admittedly, that does have a certain dramatic flair. Accurate navigation, especially when you're out of sight of land for days or even weeks on end, wasn't just a nicety. It was the absolute bedrock of survival. Get it wrong, and you didn't just miss your intended port, you missed life itself. You'd sail off into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North Atlantic, your supplies of stale bread and increasingly pungent dried fish dwindling, your water casks running low, until your ship became another ghost story whispered by the waves. Not exactly the heroic ending you envisioned when you signed up for this little adventure, is it? Probably imagined more glorious battle and less dying slowly of thirst while arguing about whose turn it was to ration the last biscuit. Imagine the psychological pressure. Each sunrise, you'd scan the horizon with a desperate hope, looking for that telltale smudge of land, the shadow of a distant mountain range. Each sunset, if nothing appeared, would bring a fresh wave of unease. Were you on course? Had you drifted? Was that current pushing you further north than intended, towards the grinding ice, or south into empty ocean? These weren't idle thoughts. They were constant, gnawing anxieties. The historical record is naturally somewhat biased towards successful voyages. After all, the ones who got hopelessly lost didn't typically return to file a detailed report on their navigational errors. Memo to future voyagers. Turns out, sailing directly into that big storm for 3 days wasn't a shortcut. So, what did they have? For shorter coastal journeys, or when island hopping where the next landfall was often within a day or two's sail, things were relatively straightforward. They used landmark navigation. Sail past the 3 seal rocks, then keep the snow-capped mountain on your port side until you see the fjord with the angry troll who lives under the bridge. Or was it a grumpy hermit? That sort of thing. They understood prevailing winds and currents from generations of experience. They observed the flight paths of birds, knowing that certain species would head towards land at dusk to roost, or away from it in the morning to feed. If you saw a flock of gannets purposefully flying in one direction, it was a pretty good bet land wasn't too far off that way. Some scholars even debate whether Vikings could interpret swell patterns, the way the ocean's surface rises and falls in long, slow undulations, which can indicate distant land masses or storm systems by how they are reflected or refracted. It's a subtle art, reading the mood of the ocean itself. But the real challenge came with the long hauls, to Iceland, to Greenland, and of course to Vinland, the tantalizingly brief Viking presence in North America. These journeys meant many days sailing with no land in sight. Here, celestial navigation was key. The sun, when visible, was their primary clock and compass. They understood its daily arc across the sky. At midday, in the northern hemisphere, the sun is at its highest point and generally to the south. This fundamental fact of life was not lost on them. They also used the stars at night. Polaris, the North Star, is a fairly reliable indicator of north, though due to the Earth's precession, it wasn't quite as perfectly aligned with true north in the Viking Age as it is today. Still, it was a damn sight better than guessing. They would have recognized familiar constellations, watching the slow pirouette around the celestial pole through the night. One documented tool they certainly possessed was a simple form of sun compass, or perhaps a sun shadow board. This might have been a wooden disc with a central pin, a gnomon. By observing the length and direction of the pin's shadow at different times of day, especially at noon when the shadow is shortest, they could get a reasonably good idea of north-south. If you know roughly what latitude you're trying to maintain, and Vikings were remarkably good at latitude sailing, keeping the midday sun at a consistent height, you could use this to stay on course. Historians still argue whether some of the more intricate carved wooden discs found, like the Unatok disc we'll touch on later, were truly such sophisticated sun compasses with pre-calculated shadow curves, or perhaps something else entirely, like a sort of decorative board game for very, very bored Vikings. Right, Bjorn, your move. Try not to knock the pieces overboard this time, or we're using your helmet as the gnomon. However, the North Atlantic is famously fickle. What happens when the sun refuses to show its cheerful golden face for days on end? When thick fog, the kind that swallows your ship whole and muffles every sound save the drip of water from the rigging, blankets the sea. or when endless grey, drizzly cloud cover obscures both sun and stars. This is where the system breaks down. Knowing the sun is somewhere up there, behind that impenetrable murk, isn't terribly helpful when you need to know exactly where. This is the critical problem, the life or death navigational puzzle that gives rise to the legend we're gently paddling towards, the mysterious Viking sunstone. The idea that they possess some kind of magical crystal that could find the sun, even when it was completely hidden, is an incredibly alluring one. It's the ancient equivalent of a magical GPS, and who wouldn't want that when facing an ocean that seems determined to swallow you? So, we've established that our Viking friends are out there, bobbing about in their rather stylish, if somewhat leaky, wooden sea serpents. And while they're not entirely without navigational know-how, they are certainly vulnerable when the heavens decide to be uncooperative. Celestial bodies, you see, are a bit like fair-weather friends in the North Atlantic. Wonderful when they're around, but infuriatingly absent when you need them most. Imagine trying to give directions to someone using only landmarks that are frequently invisible. Yeah, just turn left at the big cloud that looks vaguely like a disgruntled badger. Oh, it's gone. Well, this is awkward. Their known toolkit, as we've touched upon, was clever but limited by visibility. The sun compass, or sun shadow board, let's call it the Gnomon and Hope method, relied rather obviously on the sun actually being visible to cast a shadow. If you have a gnomon and no sun, you just have a stick on a board, which, while potentially useful for prodding a sleeping crewmate, doesn't do much for your sense of direction. It's a bit like having a wonderfully accurate wristwatch in a pitch-black cave. It's still keeping perfect time, but you can't see the hands to tell. The Vikings could certainly estimate their latitude with surprising accuracy by measuring the height of the sun at noon, using the angle of the shadow on their sun shadow board, or perhaps by sighting it over a notched stick held at arm's length, a primitive sextant. If they sailed west, for example, trying to maintain the same latitude as their home port in Norway, they'd know they were roughly on the right track if the midday sun reached the same height in the sky each day. This is actually a pretty solid technique, as long as you can see the sun at midday. Night navigation relied on the stars. Polaris, the North Star as mentioned, was their steadfast guide. Experienced Norse seafarers would have known the circumpolar stars, those that never dip below the horizon in northern latitudes, and how they wheeled around Polaris like a cosmic clock. They might have even used pairs of stars as pointers to find north or other key directions. There's also evidence, or at least strong suggestion, that they observed the migration patterns of birds. Certain birds, like puffins or guillemots, fly out to sea to feed, but return to land to roost. If you're lost, and you see a flock of puffins heading purposefully in one direction in the late afternoon, following them might just lead you to a rocky coastline, and with any luck, a less damp bed for the night. Whales, too, often follow predictable migration routes, and savvy seafarers might have gleaned directional clues from their movements. Remember that rumor about Vikings possibly using trained ravens, releasing them, and seeing which way they flew towards land? While Floki's ravens in the TV show Vikings were a neat dramatic device, concrete historical evidence for widespread systematic use of navigation ravens is a bit thin. It's more likely a poetic flourish in the sagas than a standard navigational tool. Historians still argue whether such practices were common or anecdotal exceptions. There's also the subtle art of interpreting sea conditions, wave patterns, water color. Even the type of seaweed or debris floating by could offer clues to a seasoned mariner. A change in wave patterns, for example, can indicate that you're approaching shallower water, or a landmass that's interfering with the open ocean swell. The color of the water can change too, from the deep blue of the open ocean to a greener hue closer to shore, due to sediment or plankton. It's all part of building up a complete, if sometimes fuzzy, mental map of your surroundings. You're using every sense, every scrap of information the environment offers you. It's a holistic approach, far removed from just punching coordinates into a device. It required an immense intimacy with the natural world, a constant state of observation. Consider the Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements. It recounts how Hrafna Flóki Vilgedarsson, one of the early Norse explorers of Iceland, supposedly used ravens to find his way. He released one, which flew back towards the Faroe Islands from whence they'd sailed. The second circled and landed back on the ship. Perhaps it was having second thoughts about the whole exploration gig, or just really liked the ship's cook. The third raven, however, flew purposefully northwest, and Floki followed it, eventually sighting the coast of Iceland. It's a great story, very cinematic, but it also underscores the desperate need for any advantage, any trick, that could help pierce the veil of the unknown when traditional methods failed. One slightly less romantic, but more plausible quirk of their voyages was likely the sheer amount of time spent just waiting. If the weather was truly dreadful, with zero visibility and raging seas, the most sensible thing to do was often to lower the sail, try to keep the ship headed into the waves as best as possible, and ride it out. Patience, it seems, was as vital a Viking virtue as a sharp axe, though perhaps less celebrated in song. Hark, a saga of Bjorn the Remarkably Patient, who waited 7 days for the fog to lift. Doesn't quite have the same ring to it. So, they had their sunboards, their stars, their birds, their understanding of currents. They were skilled, they were brave, they were undoubtedly hardy. But the North Atlantic weather, with its sudden fogs, its relentless cloud banks, its disorienting storms, remained their greatest adversary. This is the void, the Achilles heel of their navigational prowess, into which the shimmering possibility of the sunstone steps. The critical need for something more, something that could defy the gloom, sets the stage perfectly for a tale of a stone that held the sun's secrets. Now, the sunstone, or Solarstein in Old Norse, doesn't just pop up in dry academic treatises on Viking navigation. Its first, and arguably most evocative appearance, is nestled within the colorful tapestry of the Icelandic sagas. These aren't exactly meticulous historical documents in the modern sense. They're more like historical novels, written down centuries after the events they describe, blending fact, folklore, exaggeration, and a healthy dose of good storytelling. Think of them as the blockbuster movies of their day, full of heroes, villains, epic journeys, and the occasional grumpy troll. You wouldn't necessarily base your PhD thesis solely on the Fast and the Furious, but you'd get a certain flavor of early 21st century car culture, right? The specific mention that sparks all the fuss comes from the saga of King Olaf II of Norway, sometimes known as Saint Olaf. This saga, like others, was written down primarily in the 13th century, recounting events that supposedly took place in the early 11th century. So, there's a good couple of hundred years for memories to get creatively enhanced, shall we say. In one particular scene, King Olaf is indoors, and it's a snowy, overcast day. The kind of day where the sky is just a flat, luminous gray, and you can't tell where the sun is, even if your life or your kingdom depended on it. The king, wanting to check the time, or perhaps just to show off his meteorological prowess, asks his men to point out the sun's position. They, quite reasonably, can't. The sky is a featureless blanket of white. Then, according to the saga, King Olaf had them bring out the sunstone. He held it up, observed where light was emitted from it, or how light passed through it. The wording is a bit ambiguous. And from this, he was able to determine the sun's hidden position. Voila! Royal magic, or perhaps royal science. The saga states, the king made them fetch the solar stein and held it up, and saw where it shot a ray from itself. Thus he verified Sigurdar's guess. Sigurdur being one of his men who had ventured a guess about the sun's location. It's a wonderfully, tantalizingly brief mention. No detailed instructions on how to use it. No description of what the stone looked like. No, some assembly-required diagram. Just this one, almost casual reference to a solar stein being used to locate the sun on a completely overcast day. Historians still argue whether this passage should be interpreted literally as a navigational instrument or as a metaphor for the king's wisdom and almost supernatural insight. Perhaps it was like a kingly party trick, akin to pulling a rabbit from a hat, rather than standard naval equipment. You can imagine the scene, can't you? The huddled courtiers, shivering slightly despite their furs, peering out at the swirling snow, completely baffled. Then Olaf, all regal confidence, calls for this mysterious stone. A hush falls. He holds it up. Maybe it glints. Maybe it seems to gather the diffuse light, and then he points. There. The sun is there, you doubting Thomases. It's a moment designed to enhance the king's prestige, to show him as someone with access to knowledge or tools beyond the ordinary. Whether this event actually happened as described, or if it's a later embellishment to make King Olaf seem even more sagacious and sanely, is where the real head-scratching begins. One quirky tidbit often overlooked is that this demonstration occurs indoors during the snowstorm, not on the deck of a longship struggling through Atlantic fog. This small detail might suggest its primary context, if real, wasn't exclusively maritime navigation, or that the saga writer wasn't overly concerned with practical nautical accuracy when spinning a good yarn about their saintly king. This singular reference, along with a couple of other, even vaguer mentions in other texts, like inventories of church or monastery possessions that list a sunstone, though what kind of stone is anyone's guess. Could be a pretty gem, could be a lens, could be a paperweight with delusions of grandeur. It's pretty much the entirety of the direct textual evidence from the Viking Age or the immediately following centuries. It's not a lot to go on, is it? It's like finding a single cryptic post-it note that says magic rock finds sun, and then trying to reconstruct an entire forgotten technology from it. The saga doesn't say, and lo, Bjarni the navigator did then consult his trusty solarstein and corrected their course, thus narrowly avoiding sailing off the edge of the world, which, by the way, we now know to be round, mostly. It's far more elusive. And so, the solarstein enters the realm of legend, a half-glimpsed marvel. Was it a common tool, so ubiquitous that it barely rated a mention? Like how we wouldn't write a saga about someone using a spoon? Or was it a rare, almost magical object possessed by few? Or was it, perhaps, just a poetic way of describing keen observation? Or even a misunderstanding of how some natural crystals interact with light, later romanticized into a deliberate tool? The ambiguity is precisely what makes it so enduringly fascinating. It's a mystery that invites us to fill in the blanks, to dream of forgotten Viking ingenuity, and to imagine our shivering sailor on the Hofgander, perhaps clutching just such a stone, a beacon of hope against the gray despair of a sunless sea. So, we have this intriguing little snippet from the saga of King Olaf, a sunstone, a solarstein, that magically, or scientifically, reveals the sun's position on an overcast day. But what exactly was this stone? The sagas, bless their narrative hearts, are not technical manuals. They don't offer a handy appendix titled Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sunstones But Were Afraid to Ask a Grumpy Viking. The term solarstein itself is wonderfully, frustratingly vague. It literally translates to sunstone. That could mean almost anything, couldn't it? Your favorite yellow pebble you picked up on the beach could be a sunstone if you were feeling poetic. A piece of amber, glowing warmly in the light, might qualify. Even a particularly shiny button, if it caught the sun just right. Scholars, being the inquisitive bunch they are, have donned their metaphorical deerstalker hats and pored over these texts for generations, trying to decode the mystery. Was the solarstein a genuine navigational instrument, a piece of lost Viking technology? Or was it something more mundane, perhaps a beautiful gem valued for its appearance rather than any practical optical properties? Or could it even have been something symbolic or magical, an amulet or charm believed to hold the sun's power, rather than a tool to find its physical location? Historians still argue whether the sunstone's primary role was functional or folkloric, a debate that keeps academic conferences lively, or at least as lively as academic conferences get. Imagine a heated debate over whether a particular gemstone in a crown was for bling or for telling the time. Let's consider the non-navigational possibilities first, just to clear the air a bit. Like opening a window in a stuffy longhouse. The term sunstone appears in a few medieval Icelandic church and monastery inventories. These lists might mention, for example, 2 sunstones alongside other valuables, like silver chalices or embroidered vestments. Now, a medieval church inventory isn't typically listing rugged seafaring equipment next to its sacred relics. It's much more likely that, in this context, sunstone referred to some kind of decorative gemstone. There are several types of feldspar known as sunstone today, oligoclase or orthoclase feldspar, which exhibit a glittery effect called aventurescence, caused by tiny inclusions of hematite or guthite. They're quite pretty, shimmering with golden or reddish spangles, and certainly worthy of a place in a church treasury. They don't, however, help you find the sun in a blizzard. It would be like trying to navigate with a disco ball. Looks flashy, but functionally questionable for directional purposes unless you're trying to find the nearest dance floor. Another line of thought is that the solarstein mentioned in the sagas might have been a magnifying glass or a burning stone, a piece of clear quartz or beryl, for example, that could be used to focus sunlight to start a fire. Fire starting was a crucial skill, and a reliable way to do it without cumbersome friction methods would have been highly valued. Being able to start a fire using the sun's rays, even on a weekly sunny day, could certainly seem magical. And the name sunstone would fit perfectly. The problem here is that a burning glass doesn't help you find the sun's direction when it's obscured. It only works if you can already see the sun, or at least see where its strongest light is coming from. So, while useful, it doesn't quite fit Olaf's miraculous demonstration in the snowstorm. Then, there's the possibility of a more metaphorical interpretation. Could sunstone have been a kenning? One of those poetic, indirect turns of phrase so beloved by Norse skalds. Perhaps it referred to something bright and reflective, like a polished shield boss, or a piece of shining metal that, if angled correctly, might catch a gleam of hidden sunlight. Or maybe it wasn't a physical object at all, but a metaphor for the king's keen eyesight or divinely inspired wisdom, his sun-like ability to see through the gloom. This is where textual interpretation gets really tricky, like trying to nail jelly to a wall. The sagas are literature after all, and literature loves a bit of symbolism. Perhaps the original audience understood he used the sunstone in a way we no longer grasp, as a turn of phrase rather than a literal action. One slightly quirky, though less popular candidate sometimes floated is cordierite, also known as iolite or dichroite. This mineral exhibits strong pleochroism, meaning it appears different colors when viewed from different directions. When rotated, it can shift from violet blue to light blue to yellowish gray. The idea is that by looking at the sky through a piece of cordierite and rotating it, you might be able to detect variations in the polarization of skylight and thus infer the sun's position. It's an intriguing idea, and cordierite is found in Norway. However, whether it would be effective enough under truly overcast conditions is debatable, and there's less direct linkage to the term sunstone historically for cordierite compared to other candidates we'll explore. It's sort of the underdog in the sunstone race, a bit like that one horse in the Grand National that no one expects to win, but you can't help rooting for. So the field is wide open. Was it a pretty rock, a fire starter, a poetic flourish, or, and this is the exciting bit that gets hang high, Kukai maritime enthusiasts all of a flutter, was it a genuinely functional optical device that gave Vikings a crucial edge when the northern skies turned grumpy? The ambiguity itself is part of its charm, making the Solarstein a kind of historical Rorschach test. What you see in it says as much about your own hopes for Viking ingenuity as it does about the stone itself. All right, let's steer our ship away from purely decorative baubles and poetic metaphors and sail into the waters of practical application. If the Solarstein was indeed a functional navigational tool, as King Olaf's rather smug demonstration implies, what kind of stone are we actually talking about? Of all the geological candidates proposed over the years, one has emerged as the frontrunner, the chosen one in the Sunstone saga, Icelandic spar. Now, Icelandic spar isn't some incredibly rare exotic mineral found only in dragon hoards. It's actually a remarkably clear, transparent variety of calcite, calcium carbonate, the same stuff that makes up limestone and chalk, though in a much more beautifully crystalline form. Its claim to fame, and the reason it's at the heart of the sunstone theory, is a fascinating optical property called birefringence, or double refraction. Imagine you have a nice clear roam of Icelandic spar. If you place it over a line drawn on a piece of paper, you won't see one line, you'll see two. The crystal splits a single ray of light, passing through it into two separate rays, which travel along different paths and are polarized differently. It's a bit like the crystal has optical mood swings, treating light in two distinct ways simultaneously. This property was first described scientifically by the Danish scientist Rasmus Bartholin in 1669, who was, quite understandably, rather perplexed by this doubling effect. He called it Iceland crystal because of the superb, large, clear specimens that came from, you guessed it, Iceland, specifically from a mine at Helgestadir on the east coast, which was for centuries the primary source of high-quality optical calcite. And Iceland, as we know, was a key part of the Viking world. So, the raw material was certainly available to them. It's not like they'd have to trade with distant, unknown lands for their magic sky compass components. They were practically tripping over the stuff, geologically speaking. So, why is this double refraction, this light-splitting ability, so important for a potential sunstone? It's because one of those two rays, the extraordinary ray, behaves in a way that is particularly sensitive to the polarization of light. And skylight, even on a cloudy or foggy day, is partially polarized in a predictable pattern relative to the sun's position. Think of polarized light as light waves that are all vibrating in the same plane, like a well-drilled chorus line of photons, instead of vibrating randomly in all directions, like a mosh pit of photons. This polarization pattern in the sky forms concentric rings around the sun. Even if you can't see the sun directly, the pattern is still there, imprinted on the diffuse light passing through the clouds. The theory, put forward most compellingly by a Danish archaeologist named Thorkild Ramsku in the late 1960s, is that a Viking navigator could have used a piece of Icelandic spar to detect this polarization pattern. By looking at the sky through the crystal and rotating it, the navigator would observe changes in the brightness or distinctness of the two images produced by the double refraction. When the crystal was oriented in a particular way relative to the sun's hidden position, specifically when one of its optical axes was aligned with the plane of polarization, the two images might appear equally bright, or one might become maximally distinct while the other fades. By finding the angle at which this happens, you could, in theory, determine the direction of the sun, even if it was completely obscured by clouds or fog. It's a bit like having a secret decoder ring for the sky. Historians still argue whether the Vikings would have stumbled upon and then systematically understood this subtle optical phenomenon, or if it's a modern projection of scientific knowledge onto the past. Hey, look, Sven. When I squint through this rock at the sky and turn it, the blurry spot sometimes gets blurrier in two places. Let's sail to America. It sounds a bit unlikely when you put it that way. One quirky fringe tidbit about calcite crystals like Icelandic spar is their near-perfect cleavage. They break along very specific planes, often forming those characteristic rhombohedral shapes. This means that even if you found a big rough chunk, it could be relatively easily cleaved into usable flat-faced pieces with the right tools, or even a well-aimed tap. It wouldn't necessarily require sophisticated lapidary skills to fashion a basic sunstone if the raw material was clear enough. Nature does half the work for you. This is quite different from, say, trying to grind a lens from raw quartz, which would be a much more involved process. The Helgustadur mine in Iceland mentioned earlier was apparently so rich in this super-clear calcite that, according to later accounts, large crystals were sometimes just lying around on the surface. It was worked from at least the 17th century for optical purposes, thanks to Bartholin's discovery. But it's entirely plausible, even probable, that Icelanders knew of this strange doubling stone long before that. Whether they connected its peculiar optical behavior to navigation is the million-kroner question. Just because a material with useful properties is available doesn't automatically mean its specific application was discovered or widely adopted. For example, the ancient Greeks knew about static electricity from rubbing amber, electron in Greek, hence electricity. But they didn't go on to invent the stun gun or the electric blanket. So, we have a prime candidate material readily available in the Viking world, with the right kind of optical party trick. The question remains, did they join the dots? Did they turn this curious crystal into a reliable instrument for cheating the cloudy northern skies? All right, so we've identified our prime suspect for the Solarstein title. Icelandic spar, with its nifty trick of birefringence, that light-splitting 2 images for the price of 1 act. But how exactly does this trick help you find a sun that's hiding like a shy badger in a burrow? To understand that, we need to dive a little deeper into the rather beautiful physics of polarized light. But don't worry, I'll keep it gentle. No equations that look like a cat walked across a keyboard, I promise. This isn't advanced quantum physics for insomniacs, just a light sprinkle of light science. Imagine light from the sun as a wave, or rather, lots of tiny waves, vibrating in all directions perpendicular to the direction they're traveling. Think of a skipping rope being wiggled up and down, side to side, and every which way. That's unpolarized light. Now, when this sunlight enters Earth's atmosphere, it scatters off air molecules, tiny particles like nitrogen and oxygen. This scattering process doesn't just make the sky blue, a phenomenon known as Rayleigh scattering, a fact you can casually drop at your next awkward social gathering to impress or bemuse. It also polarizes some of the light. This means the scattered light waves tend to vibrate more in one particular plane than in others. It's as if the air molecules act like tiny directional filters, only letting light waves vibrating in a certain orientation pass through effectively in certain directions. The key thing for our potential Viking navigator is that the pattern of this polarization in the sky is directly related to the position of the sun. Even if the sun itself is completely hidden behind a thick bank of clouds, this polarization pattern persists in the light that filters through. It forms concentric bands of varying polarization intensity around the sun's actual location. Think of it like invisible ripples in a pond, with the sun being the point where the pebble was dropped. You can't see the pebble, but you can see the ripples. If you could somehow detect the orientation of these ripples of polarized light, you could trace them back to their source, the hidden sun. This is where our friend, Icelandic spar, comes back on stage. Remember how it splits light into 2 rays? And I mentioned that one of them, the extraordinary ray, is particularly sensitive to polarization. Well, when polarized light enters an Icelandic spar crystal, the relative intensities of these 2 refracted rays, the ordinary and the extraordinary, will change depending on how the crystal is oriented with respect to the plane of polarization of the incoming light. If you look through the crystal at a patch of cloudy sky and rotate the crystal slowly, you'll see the two images of whatever you're looking at, even if it's just a blurry patch of gray, change in brightness relative to each other. There will be a specific orientation of the crystal where the difference in brightness between the two images is at its maximum, or where one image is clearest and the other faintest. This specific orientation tells you something about the direction of the polarization of the light you're looking at. So, the hypothetical Viking sunstone technique would go something like this. You take your piece of Icelandic spa, hold it up to the brightest part of the overcast sky, or perhaps systematically scan different parts of the sky. You then rotate the crystal slowly in your hand. You're looking for the point where the two images you see through it show the greatest difference in brightness or clarity. When you find this point, the orientation of the crystal itself, perhaps a pre-marked axis on the stone, would indicate a line either pointing directly towards or directly away from the sun's hidden azimuth, its horizontal direction. By taking a couple of readings from different parts of the sky, or by knowing roughly whether it's morning or afternoon, you could resolve this 180-degree ambiguity and get a pretty good fix on the sun's bearing. Historians still argue whether such subtle changes in brightness would be consistently discernible by the naked eye under genuinely difficult conditions, like a raging blizzard or extremely thick fog, or if it required a certain Zen-like observational skill. Olaf, are you sure that slightly less blurry bit is pointing at the sun, or did you just miss breakfast? It's a remarkably clever concept. No batteries required, no moving parts to break, unless you drop it, of course. Then you just have two smaller, equally magical sunstones. The physics is sound. The principle of using polarization for navigation has even been observed in nature. Bees, for example, are thought to use the polarization of skylight to navigate back to their hives. So, it's not entirely far-fetched that humans might have stumbled upon a similar principle using a naturally occurring crystal. A quirky detail often mentioned in discussions of this technique is the Heidinger's brush, a very faint, yellowish, brush-like or bow-tie-shaped image that some people can perceive with the naked eye when looking at polarized light. It's an entoptic phenomenon, meaning it's generated within your own eye. Could some Vikings have been unusually sensitive to this, giving them a built-in sun detector, with the sunstone merely enhancing or confirming what they could already vaguely perceive? That's probably pushing into the realm of superhero vision, but it's a fun thought. The crucial element is training and experience. It wouldn't be an instant gratification tool. A navigator would need to practice, to learn how to interpret the subtle shifts in light and shadow seen through the crystal under various conditions. They'd need to know its quirks and limitations. But given the life or death importance of finding their way, it's plausible they would have invested the time and effort if the technique offered even a slight advantage when all else failed. The hidden dance of light in the sky, revealed by a humble crystal. It's a rather poetic solution to a very pragmatic problem. Now all this talk of Icelandic spar, polarized light, and sagacious Vikings peering at cloudy skies is wonderfully atmospheric. But does it actually work? Can you really take a chunk of calcite, go out on a foggy day, and reliably find the sun well enough to navigate a longship across the treacherous North Atlantic? This is where modern science rolls up its sleeves puts on its safety goggles and says, "Let's try this thing out." Over the past few decades, several research teams have conducted experiments to test the practical feasibility of the sunstone theory. The results, like a typically ambiguous weather forecast, have been mixed, promising, but with definite caveats. The general setup for these experiments often involves taking a genuine Icelandic spar crystal, and good quality optical calcite is still sought after for scientific instruments, so it's not just antique shop material. And then, trying to locate the sun's position under various controlled or natural sky conditions, from clear skies to partial cloud cover, to dense fog, and even simulated Arctic twilight scenarios. Sometimes these experiments are done on land, sometimes on research vessels at sea, to better mimic the conditions a Viking navigator would have faced, minus the threat of imminent drowning or being raided by other, less experimentally minded Vikings. You can almost picture the scene. Earnest scientists squinting through crystals, muttering about azimuth angles, while a bewildered seagull looks on, probably thinking, "Just follow me, lads. I know where the fish are." What have they found? Well, under moderately overcast conditions, where the sun is hidden but the cloud layer isn't impenetrably thick, Icelandic spar can indeed work surprisingly well. By rotating the crystal and observing the changes in the twin images, or the intensity of light passing through, researchers have been able to determine the sun's azimuth, its horizontal direction, with an accuracy of just a few degrees. In some experiments, accuracies of plus or minus 1 degree have been reported, which is pretty impressive. That's certainly accurate enough to be a very useful navigational aid, potentially far better than just guessing or relying on dead reckoning, which is essentially calculating your position based on your previous position, speed, and direction, and is prone to accumulating errors, like a game of telephone with your own voyage. Historians still argue whether this level of precision could be consistently achieved by an 11th century mariner without modern optical training or understanding of the underlying physics. Was it more of an "it's roughly that way" kind of tool? The real test, however, comes when conditions get truly abysmal, very thick fog, or when the sun is very low on the horizon, like during sunrise or sunset, or in high northern latitudes during winter, or when there's uniform, dense cloud cover with no discernible brighter patch in the sky. Here, the sunstone's performance tends to drop off significantly. The polarization signal from the sky becomes much weaker and more diffuse, making it harder to detect reliably with the crystal. Some studies have concluded that in such extreme conditions, the sunstone might be little better than guesswork. Others suggest that even a rough indication of the sun's direction could still be valuable if you were completely disoriented. If you're lost in a snowstorm, knowing that east is vaguely over there-ish is better than having no clue at all. It might not get you to your precise destination, but it might stop you sailing in circles until your fermented shark runs out. One quirky limitation that experiments have highlighted is something called the neutral points in the sky. These are specific points, the Arago, Babinet, and Brewster points, named after the scientists who discovered them, located roughly 90 degrees away from the sun, where the skylight polarization is zero or very weak. If you happen to be looking at one of these neutral points with your sunstone, you wouldn't detect any significant polarization, which could be misleading. An experienced user would likely learn to avoid these areas or take multiple readings from different parts of the sky to compensate. Perhaps Viking lore included rhymes like, "If the sky looks dull and plain, shift thy gaze and look again." Probably not, but you get the idea. Furthermore, the accuracy can depend on the quality of the crystal itself, its clarity, size, and how well it's cut or claved. And of course, the skill of the operator is paramount. Just as one person might be a virtuoso with a musical instrument, while another can barely get a squeak out of it, some individuals might have been naturally better at interpreting the subtle visual cues offered by the sunstone. It's not a point-and-click device. Another practical challenge would be using it on a pitching, rolling longship deck with salt spray in your eyes and a grumpy berserker asking if dinner is ready yet. Maintaining a steady hand and making careful observations in those conditions would require considerable seamanship and concentration. So, the experiments show that Icelandic spar can work as a sun finder, especially when other methods fail due to moderate cloud cover. It's not an infallible magic bullet, and it has its limitations. But it's plausible enough to keep the theory alive and kicking. The scientists are essentially saying, yes, this is physically possible, and under certain conditions, it's even quite effective. The big remaining question is whether the Vikings actually did it. Did they discover this property, develop the technique, and rely on it for their remarkable voyages? The modern tests provide a maybe under the right circumstances, which is frustratingly, wonderfully historically appropriate. While Icelandic spar remains the celebrity candidate in our sunstone quest, there's another intriguing archaeological find that sometimes gets honorary membership in the Viking Navigational Aid Club, the unresolved disc. This isn't a crystal, but a rather curious wooden artifact discovered in 1948 in the ruins of a Norse Benedictine convent. Yes, Vikings had convents, though perhaps with more robustly brewed ale, in Unartok Fjord in southwestern Greenland. It dates from the Viking settlement period, likely around the 11th or 12th century, putting it squarely in the time frame we're interested in. It's a fragment, sadly not the whole piece, of what appears to have been a circular wooden disc, about 70 millimeters, just under 3 inches, in diameter, made of fir or larch wood. What makes it so interesting are the intricate carvings on its surface. The Unartok disc fragment has a central hole, like many sun compasses or shadow boards might have had for a gnomon, the shadow casting pin. Radiating out from this, or perhaps more accurately, arranged in concentric patterns, are a series of carved lines and notches. Some of these lines are quite precisely incised. The immediate thought, of course, was, could this be a part of a sophisticated sun compass? Perhaps one designed to work even at the high latitudes of Greenland, where the sun's path across the sky is quite different from more southerly climes. Could these lines represent pre-calculated shadow curves for different times of day or year, allowing a navigator to determine north, or perhaps even their latitude, with greater precision than a simple shadow stick? Imagine it, a sort of ancient Scandinavian astrolabe, but made of wood, and presumably less prone to saltwater corrosion than fancy brass. You could almost see a weather-beaten Viking navigator, squinting at the shadow cast by a central pin as it fell across these mysterious lines, muttering, According to the sacred etchings of Unartok, we should be seeing more puffins by now.
The debate around the Unartok disk is a classic, what is this thing, archaeological puzzle. On one hand, its design does bear a superficial resemblance to what one might expect from a portable sun compass. The care taken in carving the lines suggests it was more than just a decorative doodle or a Viking-era beer coaster. Some researchers have proposed that the markings correspond to the shadow lengths and directions cast by a gnomon at specific latitudes in Greenland, particularly during the summer sailing season. If so, it would be a remarkable piece of empirical science and craftsmanship, a testament to the Vikings' observational skills and their ability to codify that knowledge into a practical tool. It would have been invaluable for navigating around the complex fjord systems of Greenland or for making landfall accurately after a long sea voyage. However, not everyone is convinced it's a sun compass. Historians still argue whether the Unartok disk's markings truly align with astronomical phenomena in a practical way, or if attempts to interpret them as such are a form of wishful thinking, seeing patterns where none were intended, or where the surviving fragment is too incomplete to make a definitive judgment. Some skeptics suggest it could have been part of a game board. Vikings loved their board games like Hnefatafel, sometimes called Viking chess. Perhaps it was a scoring device, or a miniature version of some ritualistic or divinatory tool. The convent setting might also suggest a non-navigational purpose. Perhaps it was used for calculating feast days or as a meditative aid. Sister Inga, have you seen my prayer wheel / emergency sundial? The central hole could have been for a peg to spin it, or to affix it to something else. One particularly quirky alternative theory, which highlights the range of possibilities, is that it might have been a confession dial, or some kind of devotional item related to keeping track of prayers or penances. This would fit the convent context, but it doesn't quite explain the seemingly systematic nature of the lines in a way that screams celestial navigation. Another line of thought is that even if it was some kind of sighting or measuring device, it wasn't necessarily for the sun. Could it have been used for surveying land, or for some craft purpose requiring precise angles or divisions? The wood itself, being fir or larch, is interesting. These aren't native Greenlandic trees, so the wood, or perhaps the finished object, was imported, most likely from Norway or North America, Vinland, indicating it was an item of some value. The Unartok disk doesn't directly help us with the sunstone question in terms of locating the sun when it's hidden. A sun compass, however sophisticated, still needs sunshine to cast a shadow, but it's relevant to our broader discussion of Viking navigational prowess. If they were capable of creating and using devices like the Unartok disk, assuming it is a sun compass, it shows a high level of understanding of solar movements and a commitment to developing practical tools for navigation. It would complement the idea of the sunstone rather than replace it. One tool for clear days, another for cloudy ones. The real frustration with the Unartok disk is its fragmentary nature. If only we had the whole thing. It's like finding one beautifully crafted piece of a jigsaw puzzle and then trying to guess the picture, the size, and whether it was even a picture of a landscape or a particularly complicated abstract doodle. Its enigmatic carvings continue to tease researchers, a silent wooden witness from a Greenlandic fjord, holding its secrets close. So let's bring our gaze back to that moment of supreme Viking frustration. The sun has well and truly clocked off for the day, or perhaps for several days, hidden behind an impenetrable curtain of North Atlantic gloom. The sky is a monotonous, featureless gray. Fog, thicker than a troll's winter pelt, has rolled in, reducing visibility to a few boat lengths. Your magnificent sun compass, perhaps even a fancy Unartok-style disc with all its intricate carvings, is now about as useful as a chocolate teapot. Your knowledge of star patterns is equally redundant. This is it. This is the precise scenario where the solar stein, the sun-finding crystal, would graduate from interesting theoretical device to absolute lifesaver. If it works as advertised by King Olaf's saga, this is its moment to shine, or rather to help you find where the sun is attempting to shine. Imagine the atmosphere on your longship, the Havgunder. Days have passed with no clear sight of sun or stars. The air is damp and chilling, seeping into your woolen cloak, into your bones. The constant motion of the ship, the creaking timbers, the slap of waves, it all becomes a disorienting, monotonous backdrop to a growing unease. Where are you? How far have you drifted from your intended course? Are you even still heading west, towards the promised lands of Iceland or Greenland? Or has some mischievous current, some Loki of the ocean, turned you unknowingly towards the barren ice fields of the north, or into the vast, empty expanse of the south? Doubt, like a cold sea mist, begins to creep into the hearts of even the hardiest crew members. The ship's cook is starting to look at the scrawniest cabin boy with a speculative glint in his eye, and you're pretty sure that's not because he's planning on adopting him. This is where the navigator, if he possessed such a stone and the knowledge to use it, would become the most important person on board. Arguably, he always was, but his importance just got a serious upgrade. He would carefully unwrap his precious solar stein, perhaps a hand-sized roam of clear Icelandic spar, kept in a soft leather pouch. He might retreat to the most stable part of the ship, or ask for a brief steadying of the vessel if the seas allowed, though that's a big ask in a proper blow. Then, the procedure we discussed earlier would unfold. He'd hold the crystal up towards what he judges to be the brightest part of the oppressive overcast. He'd rotate it slowly, his gaze intent, searching for that subtle interplay of light, that telltale sign in the twin images, or perhaps just in the way the diffuse light itself seems to pass through the stone. Historians still argue whether they'd look directly through the crystal at the sky, or if they might have allowed a patch of skylight to pass through the crystal onto a shaded surface, looking for a particular pattern or spot of light. The saga isn't exactly a user manual.
even if its efficacy is debated by us thousands of years later. For the Vikings, if they believed the sunstone worked, it would have been a significant morale booster. Just the act of consulting it and performing the ritual could provide a sense of control in an uncontrollable environment. It's a bit like how some people feel better having a map in the glove compartment, even if they mostly use GPS now. It's a comfort, and comfort, however small, is a valuable commodity when you're facing the raw, indifferent power of the North Atlantic.
The biggest challenge, of course, would be in the truly awful conditions. If the cloud layer is so thick and uniform that virtually no polarized light gets through, or if the fog is so dense it's like sailing through milk, then even the most magical seeming calcite crystal would likely be defeated. There are physical limits. The sagas don't specify the degree of overcast. King Olaf's snowy day might have been bright overcast, where the sun's position was obscured, but a lot of light still permeated the cloud cover. It might not have been a full-on whiteout blizzard, where you can't see your own feet. We tend to imagine the most extreme scenarios when we think of sunstones, but perhaps their most common and effective use was in those frustratingly middling conditions, not clear, not a total pea souper, but just generally gray and unhelpful. The kind of day where you sigh and say, well, this is just dreary. And a Viking might say, right, time for the shiny rock.
While we're engrossed in the fascinating physics of polarizing crystals and deciphering cryptic sagas, let's not forget the actual blokes, and possibly some shield maidens, though direct evidence for them on long-haul voyages is more saga fodder than hard fact. Who were out there on these ships? Life aboard a Viking Nar, the workhorse cargo vessel, as opposed to the sleeker, faster longship, though both were used for exploration and settlement. On a multi-week voyage to, say, Iceland or Greenland was not a pleasure cruise. It was a masterclass in enduring discomfort, monotony, and the constant lurking possibility of a very wet and cold demise. No Lido deck, no midnight buffet, unless you count gnawing on dried cod in the pitch dark as a culinary event. Picture yourself on the Fjörgen's Favor, a sturdy Nar, wider and deeper in the hull than a longship, designed more for carrying capacity. Livestock, timber, trade goods, hopeful settlers and their worldly possessions, than for lightning raids. You're still packed in, but perhaps with a bit more cargo and a bit less let's go conquer something energy. The smells, however, are probably fairly similar. Damp wool, stale food, unwashed bodies, seasickness, yours and others, and, if you're unlucky enough to be transporting cattle, the distinct aroma of bovine anxiety and its byproducts. You'd be sleeping out in the open or under a makeshift awning of oiled sailcloth if you were lucky, huddled together for warmth against the biting North Atlantic wind. Remember those cozy sleeping bags and thermal wear we take for granted? Yeah, not so much. You've got your woolen cloak, maybe some animal skins, and your shipmates for shared body heat. Social distancing was not a major concern, clearly. Food would be basic and repetitive. Dried fish, cod, ling, haddock, was a staple, a bit like super chewy, salty protein bars. They'd also have dried or smoked meat, perhaps mutton or pork. Hardtack biscuits, those notoriously tooth-breakingly hard flatbreads, would provide some carbohydrate. Maybe some soured milk products like Skyr, if they could keep it from going completely sentient. They'd carry fresh water in wooden casks, but it would get stale and unpleasant pretty quickly. Beer, or mead, might also be on board, possibly preferred as it was less likely to harbor nasty bacteria than old water. Still, hydration without a convenient tap or a chilled bottle from the fridge was a constant concern. Historians still argue about the precise details of their diet at sea and how they managed to avoid widespread scurvy on very long voyages, though some suggest stored fruit like apples or even foraged seaweed if they made interim landfalls might have helped. Perhaps a bit of early sorrel if they timed their spring departure right. The phrase, "you are what you eat," takes on a rather grim dimension when your main food group is things that have been desiccated to within an inch of their afterlife. Daily routine. When the weather was fair, it would be governed by the needs of sailing, adjusting the sail, bailing out the inevitable leaks. Viking ships were wonderfully flexible, which also meant they weren't perfectly watertight, a bit like a very old but beloved convertible car, keeping watch and trying not to get on the nerves of the guy whose job it was to steer with that massive side rudder. Boredom would be a significant enemy. They might sing songs, tell stories, perhaps the very sagas we're now dissecting, gamble with dice, or engage in the timeless sailor's pastime of staring moodily at the horizon. Maybe some mending of clothes or gear. If you brought your whittling knife, you could create small carvings, or perhaps just sharpen a lot of pegs for no particular reason. There's a certain quiet dignity to a Viking diligently whittling a peg that serves absolutely no purpose other than to pass an hour between bouts of abject terror and crushing boredom. And then there's the human effort. Sailing these ships wasn't just about hoisting a sail and letting the wind do the work. It required constant vigilance and physical exertion. In storms, or when trying to make progress against an unfavorable wind, the crew might have to row the heavy sweep oars, back-breaking labor that would leave your hands raw and your muscles screaming. Imagine trying to control a 30 or 40-ton vessel in a heaving sea using just muscle power and a big steering paddle. It's a testament to their strength, skill, and sheer bloody-mindedness. There were no automated winches, no sophisticated rigging systems beyond the basics. Every adjustment, every struggle against the elements was done by hand, by straining sinew. A quirky detail of life at sea would have been the total lack of privacy. There's no captain's cabin in the luxury sense on most of these working vessels. Everyone was in it together, exposed to the elements in each other's bodily functions and bad moods. Sanitation? Let's just say it was rudimentary. Probably a bucket over the side, if you were feeling polite and the waves weren't too high. Sickness could spread rapidly in such close quarters. An injury could easily become fatal without access to modern medicine. If you got a bad infection from a splinter, or broke a leg when a wave swept you across the deck, your prospects weren't great. So, amidst the heroic narratives of discovery and conquest, remember the mundane realities, the itchiness, the hunger, the cold, the fear, and the overwhelming smell of damp Viking. It makes their achievements and their desperate need for any reliable navigational tool all the more remarkable. Now, if these sunstones, these magical Icelandic spar crystals, were indeed a relatively common and crucial piece of Viking navigational kit, you'd expect to find them popping up in archaeological digs, wouldn't you? Alongside the rusted axe heads, the brooches, the pottery shards, and the occasional disgruntled-looking skeleton, surely we'd be unearthing these little rooms of calcite from shipwrecks, coastal settlements, or even Viking graves, perhaps clutched in the bony hand of a long-dead navigator. This, however, is where the sunstone theory hits a bit of an archaeological sandbar. Despite decades of searching and hoping, definitive, unambiguous sunstones are conspicuously, almost deafeningly, absent from the Viking archaeological record. It's like looking for your car keys when you're already late. The more desperately you need to find them, the more elusive they seem. Think about it. We find other delicate items from the Viking Age. We find amber beads, glass game pieces, wooden carvings, even fragments of cloth. Calcite, while it can cleave easily, is a relatively stable mineral. It's not going to dissolve into nothingness over 1,000 years in most burial environments, especially if it's a decent-sized crystal. So why haven't we found caches of them in harbor sites or in the graves of individuals who might have been seafarers or chieftains wealthy enough to own such a specialized tool? Historians still argue whether this lack of archaeological evidence is a fatal blow to the sunstone theory, or if there are plausible explanations for their absence. Maybe they were so valuable they were passed down until they were lost in non-archaeological contexts, like a family heirloom dropped overboard centuries later. One argument is that they might not be recognized for what they are. Imagine an archaeologist excavating a site and finding a rough, somewhat cloudy chunk of calcite. Unless they were specifically looking for a sunstone and knew what to look for, which is itself debatable, as we don't have a definitive Viking sunstone type specimen. They might just catalog it as unidentified mineral fragment or natural crystal inclusion and move on. It doesn't scream navigational instrument unless it's exceptionally clear and perfectly formed, or perhaps found in a very specific context, like inside a navigator's pouch alongside other tools, which, again, we haven't found. It's a bit like trying to identify the first stone tools. A naturally broken rock can look a lot like a crudely fashioned chopper until you develop a very keen eye for the subtle signs of human modification. Another possibility is that they were indeed very rare. Perhaps only a few master navigators possessed them, or maybe they were seen as having magical properties and were thus guarded closely, not buried with the dead or casually discarded. If they were incredibly precious, like the medieval equivalent of a top-secret military GPS, then their scarcity in the archaeological record would make more sense. However, if they were rare, were they really a widespread solution to the problem of navigating in cloudy conditions? Or just an occasional ace up the sleeve for a very select few? This diminishes their role as a common Viking navigational staple. You can't base an entire navigational strategy for a seafaring culture on a tool that only 3 guys own, one of whom is currently using his as a paperweight. Then, there's the wrong material argument. What if the solar stein of the sagas wasn't Icelandic spar at all? What if it was another type of crystal, perhaps one less likely to survive archaeologically, or one that looks even more innocuous? We've briefly touched on cordierite, iolite, which can show pleochroism. While also a fairly stable silicate mineral, perhaps its distinctive optical property wasn't recognized or linked to the sunstone until much later. If the original sunstones were something more perishable, or something that mimics common beach pebbles unless expertly examined, they could easily be overlooked. This, however, feels a bit like special pleading, inventing reasons why the evidence should be missing. A particularly intriguing, if somewhat speculative, quirky tidbit related to this is the find from the Alderney, an Elizabethan-era shipwreck found off the coast of the Channel Islands. Amongst its cargo is a single piece of Icelandic spar, found very close to other navigational instruments like dividers. Now, this is a 16th century ship, hundreds of years after the Viking Age. However, it does show that Icelandic spar was being carried on ships alongside navigational tools much later in history. It doesn't prove Vikings used it, but it adds a little circumstantial, interesting to the debate. Was it an heirloom, a scientific curiosity, or a late survival of an older tradition? Some researchers have even tried to use this Alderney crystal for sun-finding experiments, with some success, suggesting that even a crystal of that type could have been functional. The silence from the graves and the harbor mud is perhaps the most challenging piece of counter-evidence for the sunstone enthusiasts. If these stones were key to the Viking expansion, to their daring voyages across the North Atlantic, you'd expect some tangible trace. The fact that we find swords, shields, jewelry, and even the occasional ship burial, but no universally accepted solarstein, is a significant elephant in the longhouse. It forces us to consider that perhaps the saga mentions are poetic, or refer to something else entirely, or that the tool was so specialized, so rare, or made of such an unlikely material that it has simply and frustratingly vanished from the physical record, leaving only a shimmering legend behind. So, we stand at a bit of a crossroads, don't we? On one path, we have the enticing allure of the sagas, King Olaf's seemingly casual display of sun-finding prowess, and the compelling physics of Icelandic spar. On the other, we have the stark, stony silence of the archaeological record, a distinct lack of glittering calcite roams turning up in Viking longhouses or shipwrecks. This leads to a fascinating and ongoing debate among historians, archaeologists, and enthusiasts. Was the solarstein a legendary gem, perhaps more symbolic than functional, or a genuinely lost tool, a piece of forgotten Viking ingenuity that gave them an edge on the stormy northern seas? Or perhaps, like many things in history, is the truth a blurry mix of both? Let's lean into the legendary gem idea for a moment. The sagas, as we've established, are not scientific treatises. They are literature, designed to entertain, to inspire, to celebrate heroes and lament tragedies. Could the solarstein in the saga of King Olaf be a literary device? Perhaps it was a way to emphasize the king's wisdom, his almost supernatural connection to the natural world, or even his divine favor. In a world where magic and reality often intertwined, a king who could command the sun's location, even symbolically through a special stone, would be a powerful figure indeed. The stone itself might have been a real object, perhaps a beautiful crystal he owned, but its sun-finding ability could have been an embellishment, a bit of royal propaganda woven into the narrative. Behold King Olaf, so wise he can find the sun even when the gods hide it. Also, he has excellent taste in rocks. Think about other legendary objects in folklore and literature. King Arthur's Excalibur, the Holy Grail, Jason's Golden Fleece. These items are often imbued with magical properties and serve symbolic roles within their stories. They represent power, purity, quests, divine right. Perhaps the solarstein belongs more in this category, a semi-mythical object whose story tells us more about Viking Age beliefs and storytelling conventions than about their actual navigational practices. It's not to say it wasn't based on something real, but that its function in the saga might be primarily metaphorical. Then there's the lost tool argument. Proponents of this view suggest that the sunstone was a genuine functional instrument, the knowledge of which was perhaps specialized and not widely disseminated, or eventually faded from use as other navigational methods improved, or as the great Viking seafaring age waned. If it was primarily used by a select group of master navigators, its physical remnants might be scarce. And if newer, perhaps simpler, or more reliable techniques emerged, like more widespread use of the magnetic compass, which began to appear in Europe in the 12th to 13th centuries, overlapping with the late Viking Age and saga writing period. The sunstone might have simply become obsolete, its secrets forgotten like an outdated piece of software. Imagine trying to explain a slide rule to a teenager today. You'd likely get a blank stare and a suggestion to just Google it. Historians still argue whether the practical challenges of consistently and accurately using a sunstone, especially on a heaving ship in terrible weather, would have made it a reliable cornerstone of Viking navigation, or more of a last resort, a hopeful crystal for desperate times. If it was finicky and required a lot of skill and ideal, or at least not too terrible, cloudy conditions, it might not have been a universally adopted tool, but rather a specialist item for specific circumstances. This could also account for its archaeological rarity. Perhaps most voyages relied on traditional methods, and the sunstone was only brought out for the really tough gigs, like trying to find Vinland in a permanent state of fog. One quirky fringe theory to consider is the idea of secret knowledge. What if the use of the sunstone was a closely guarded secret among a guild of navigators, passed down orally from master to apprentice? Such traditions of privileged knowledge existed in many ancient and medieval crafts. If the secret was lost, perhaps due to a decline in long-distance voyages or key practitioners perishing at sea, then both the tool and the technique could vanish relatively quickly from common practice, leaving only faint echoes in the sagas. This has a certain romantic appeal, the idea of a hidden society of sunstone-wielding sea masters, but it's very difficult to prove or disprove archaeologically. It relies on an absence of evidence being interpreted as evidence of secrecy, which is a tricky logical path to tread. Ultimately, the debate circles back to the nature of the evidence. We have a tantalizing literary clue, plausible physics for a specific material, Icelandic spar, some supportive, though not conclusive modern experiments, but a frustrating void in the ground. Was it a common tool that just hasn't been found or recognized yet? Was it a rare marvel? Or was it mostly legend, a glint of literary gold in the rich mine of the sagas? The truth likely lies somewhere in the murky waters between these positions. Perhaps it was a real tool, used by some sometimes, but its legend grew in the telling, making it seem more magical or more ubiquitous than it truly was. The Solarstein continues to capture the imagination precisely because it embodies this uncertainty, a testament to Viking courage and a puzzle for our modern desire to understand their world. It's the maybe that keeps us looking and keeps us wondering about those intrepid voyages into the sunless mists. All right. So if the prime suspect, Icelandic spar, isn't turning up in the archaeological shopping basket as often as we'd like, and if we're considering that the sunstone of the sagas might not be quite the dedicated navigational instrument modern theory has shaped it into, What other explanations could there be for those cryptic saga references? Are we perhaps chasing a single, highly specific interpretation when the reality might have been more mundane, more varied, or even more sparkly in a non-navigational way? One very straightforward alternative is that Solarstein simply referred to any particularly bright, sun-like, or reflective stone that was admired for its beauty. Remember those church inventories listing sunstones alongside other treasures? They almost certainly weren't cataloging navigational aids. In Old Norse, stein just means stone or rock. Solar means suns or of the sun. So, sunstone. This could easily apply to amber, which has a warm, sunny glow and was highly prized by Vikings for jewelry and amulets. Amber also has the fascinating property of generating static electricity when rubbed, the electron connection we touched on earlier, which might have given it an extra touch of magic or significance. While amber wouldn't help you find the sun's direction in fog, a particularly fine piece might well have been called a sunstone simply for its appearance and value. Imagine a chieftain showing off a magnificent amber pendant. Behold my Solarstein. It cost me 3 cows and a slightly used helmet, but doesn't it capture the very essence of a summer afternoon? Similarly, other bright yellowish or reddish gemstones available to the Vikings, like carnelian or certain types of garnet, could have earned the moniker sunstone. These were used in beads, inlays, and other decorative items. Their primary function would be aesthetic or symbolic, not practical navigation. Perhaps King Olaf, in that snowy saga scene, was holding up a particularly splendid gem he owned, and his seeing where it shot a ray from itself was a poetic description of its glitter or a reflection, which he then, with his kingly wisdom, or a lucky guess based on the time of day, used to impress his courtiers regarding the sun's position. It doesn't preclude him from also being a good judge of natural signs, but the stone itself might have been more of a prop than a precision instrument. Historians still argue whether the saga descriptions prioritize literal accuracy over dramatic effect when it comes to such details. Then there's the possibility that sunstone could refer to something that helps with the sun in a different way, like a burning glass. We mentioned this earlier. A clear crystal, perhaps quartz or beryl, shaped or naturally formed, to act as a lens to concentrate sunlight and start fires. Being able to make fire easily, especially in damp conditions or when tinder was scarce, would have been incredibly valuable. A stone that could harness the sun's power to bring forth flame would certainly deserve the name sunstone. This would be a highly practical tool, just not for navigation. And again, it requires some sun to be present, even if weak, not a completely obscured sky for directional finding. Could the saga account be a slightly confused or conflated memory, blending the idea of a special stone related to the sun with the act of divining its position? What about reflective objects? Could a Solarstein have been a piece of highly polished metal, like a small bronze or silver disc, or even a piece of reflective pyrite, fool's gold, which can have a bright sun-like glitter? If angled correctly, such an object could catch a faint gleam of light from a hidden sun, or perhaps reflect a brighter patch of sky, offering a very rudimentary clue. It's a bit of a stretch to call this a reliable navigational method, more akin to hoping for a lucky flash, but the name would fit. You know how a well-polished shield boss could be dazzling? Perhaps a pocket sun of sorts. One quirky fringe idea that sometimes surfaces is whether sunstone could even be a metaphorical term for an exceptionally keen-eyed individual, someone with eyes like the sun, able to discern subtle clues in the sky that others missed. Go fetch Ragnar Sunstone. He can spot a seagull at 3 leagues and tell you what it had for breakfast. Unlikely as a primary meaning, but it shows how broad the interpretation could be. Another angle to consider is translation and transmission. The sagas were written down centuries after the Viking Age proper, often by Christian monks or scholars in Iceland. Meanings of words can shift over time. What Solarstein meant to an 11th century Viking might have been subtly different to a 13th century scribe. Furthermore, when these sagas were then translated into modern languages, further layers of interpretation were added. Perhaps the translators, aware of Ramsku's theory about Icelandic spar, were more inclined to interpret sunstone in a navigational context. The very focus on it as a navigation device is a relatively modern phenomenon, really taking off in the late 20th century. So, while the Icelandic spar theory is elegant and scientifically plausible, it's important to remember that sunstone in the original text could have covered a wider semantic range. It might not have been a single specific thing, but a category of stones admired for their sun-like qualities, or their connection to fire, or simply their brilliance. This doesn't make the quest for a Viking navigational crystal any less fascinating, but it does remind us to keep an open mind and to acknowledge that sometimes a shiny rock is just a shiny rock. Unless, of course, it's a shiny rock that can find the sun in a blizzard. Then it's a legend. And so, here we are, adrift on a sea of speculation, the horizon still tantalizingly hazy. The Viking sunstone, the Solarstein, remains one of history's more enchanting maritime mysteries. Like a siren's song, it calls to our imagination with its promise of lost knowledge and forgotten ingenuity. Whether it was a precisely cleaved roam of Icelandic spar, a humble piece of cordierite, a bright piece of amber, a mere literary flourish in a grand saga, or something else entirely that we haven't even considered, its legend endures with a persistence worthy of a Viking longship weathering a North Atlantic gale. It's the what if that keeps the story alive. The romantic allure of the sunstone is undeniable. It speaks to a desire to see the Vikings not just as fierce warriors and raiders, the stereotypical image of horned helmets, which, by the way, they mostly didn't wear in battle. That's more of a 19th century operatic invention, a little historical fashion faux pas for you, but also, as sophisticated explorers, keen observers of the natural world, and masters of the sea. The idea that they possessed a tool that allowed them to navigate even when the sun and stars abandoned them adds another layer to their mystique. It elevates their voyages from mere acts of bravery or desperation to feats of remarkable technical skill. You can almost picture it. The grizzled navigator, his face etched by wind and salt, calmly consulting his crystal while lesser men despair, his quiet confidence a beacon in the storm. It's a powerful image, the kind that movies are made of, or at least very sleepy YouTube videos. Modern culture has certainly embraced the sunstone. It pops up in historical fiction, in video games, often as a magical artifact or a crucial quest item. Find the sunstone of Icelandic bling to unlock the next level. And in popular science discussions about Viking technology, It has become a shorthand symbol for Viking navigational prowess, whether the hard evidence fully supports it or not. This popular persistence is interesting in itself. It shows how a compelling idea, even one resting on somewhat limited direct evidence, can take root and flourish in the public consciousness. Historians still argue whether this popular fascination helps or hinders serious scholarship. Does it generate interest and funding, or does it perpetuate myths and oversimplify complex realities? Perhaps a bit of both. It's the historical equivalent of a catchy pop song. Not always deep, but it certainly gets stuck in your head. Even as definitive archaeological proof remains as elusive as a clear sky during a Shetland winter, the scientific inquiry continues. Researchers are still refining experiments with polarizing crystals, exploring different materials, and re-examining archaeological finds with fresh eyes. New analytical techniques might one day reveal overlooked evidence. Perhaps a future excavation of a perfectly preserved Viking shipwreck, maybe one trapped in an anoxic fjord environment, will yield a navigator's kit, complete with a clearly identifiable sunstone, and perhaps even a set of spare batteries. Okay, probably not the batteries. Until then, the debate will continue, fueled by new theories, new interpretations of old texts, and the occasional surprising experimental result. It's a healthy process, this constant questioning and reevaluation. That's how our understanding of the past, however piecemeal, grows. One quirky final thought on the sunstone's persistence. Maybe its elusiveness is part of its charm. If we had found hundreds of them, neatly labeled in museum drawers, would the mystery still hold the same power? Perhaps not. It's the unknown, the possibility, that makes it so captivating. It's a story that hasn't quite found its ending, a puzzle with a few crucial pieces still missing, inviting us to fill in the gaps with our own imagination and, hopefully, with a gentle descent into slumber. The Vikings sailed into the unknown, and in a way, the sunstone itself has sailed into a similar realm of historical mystery, a glittering point of light just beyond our full grasp. And as you too drift off towards your own unknown horizons of sleep, perhaps you can imagine that Viking ship, the Havgander or the Fjörgen's favor, finally sighting land. The cry goes up, "Land ahoy!" A smudge on the horizon that slowly resolves into cliffs, mountains, the promise of fresh water and firm ground beneath weary feet. Whether they found their way by sun shadow board, by the patient observation of birds and stars, by an uncanny instinct for the sea, or perhaps, just perhaps, with the aid of a mystical light-splitting crystal, their journeys remain one of humanity's great adventures. The enduring mystery of the sunstone is just one small, sparkling facet of that much larger, more complex, and utterly fascinating story. The sky above you now, the real sky beyond your window, may be dark, or perhaps brushed with the first hints of dawn depending on where and when you are listening to this. But somewhere, the sun is always shining, even if hidden. And the urge to explore, to understand, to find our way through the mists is a deeply human one, as true for us today as it was for those Norse seafarers 1,000 years ago. The sunstone, real or legendary, is a beautiful symbol of that timeless quest. The great wooden hull of the Havgander slides gently through the dark, still waters of a sheltered fjord. The wind has dropped, and the square sail, which has pulled you faithfully across so many leagues of ocean, now hangs slack from the yardarm. Only the soft dip and splash of oars, wielded with a weary but satisfied rhythm, breaks the profound silence of the northern night. Above, the stars, if they are visible, seem to hang like diamond dust scattered across an immense sweep of black velvet. Or perhaps the clouds still linger, a soft, comforting blanket that muffles the world, making your vessel feel like the only thing in existence. A tiny pocket of warmth and weary humanity gliding towards rest. The air smells of pine from the forested slopes that rise steeply on either side of the fjord, of damp earth, and perhaps, faintly, of wood smoke from a distant, unseen settlement. The tension of the open sea has eased. Shoulders that were hunched against the wind and spray can now relax. Voices, when they speak, are low, subdued, no longer needing to shout over the roar of the elements. There is a sense of arrival, of journey's end, or at least, journey's pause. The search for the sun, whether with keen eyes, clever tools, or mystical stones, is over for now. The sun will rise again in its own good time, and with it, new challenges and new paths. But for this moment, all is calm. The gentle lapping of water against the clinker-built planks is a soothing lullaby. The rhythmic creak of the oarlocks is like a slow, steady heartbeat. You can feel the immense, ancient stillness of the land around you, a land that has witnessed countless sunrises and weathered innumerable storms, just as it will witness many more. Let the gentle motion of the ship, real or imagined, rock you softly. Let the peace of this sheltered water seep into your thoughts, washing away the cares of the day, just as the ocean waves once washed the salt from the vessel's timbers. There is nothing more to navigate tonight, nothing more to seek. All that is required is to drift, to rest, to let go, easing into the deep, quiet waters of sleep. Sweet dreams.